In the last week of August, 1942, a force of Japanese Marines who had never been beaten on land stepped ashore in a flooded coconut plantation on the eastern tip of Papua, expecting to find a few hundred defenders guarding a half-finished airfield. There were nearly 9,000 men waiting for them in the mud and the rain. 12 days later, the Marines did something that no Japanese land force had done since the war began. They stopped. They gathered up their wounded and their starving, and in the darkness, they sailed away. It was the first time the spell broke. And most of the country those men fought for has never learned the name of the place where they broke it. Tell me in the comments, before we go any further, had you ever heard of the Battle of Milne Bay? Because what happened in that swamp overturned what the war thought it knew about who could and could not be beaten. Now let's go. To understand how a few thousand exhausted men in a malarial swamp managed to halt an army that had not yet learned how to lose, you have to begin with the year that came before them, because it was a year made almost entirely of defeat. From the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the Japanese advance had rolled through the Pacific and through Southeast Asia with the momentum of something that could not be argued with. Malaya fell. Singapore, the fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, surrendered in February of 1942 in the largest capitulation in British military history. Tens of thousands of men marching into a captivity many would never return from. The Dutch East Indies fell. The Philippines fell. Darwin was bombed in the same month, the first time a foreign power had struck the Australian mainland. And Australians looked, as they had never before had cause to, at a map of their own northern approaches and understood that the war was no longer something happening to other people in other places. It was coming toward them, island by island, down the long chain of the Southwest Pacific. And there was very little in its path. It is hard now to recover how frightening that season felt from inside Australia. The country had sent the best of its army overseas, and now found the enemy on its own doorstep with the cupboard half bare. A nation of 7 million people watched an empire that had seemed permanent come apart in a matter of weeks, and understood that the thing standing between them and the same fate was a thin screen of soldiers, many of them young and half-trained, somewhere up in the islands to the north. Papua was that screen. Whatever happened in Papua happened, in a real sense, to Australia itself, and everyone from the high command down to the ordinary soldier in the mud understood that the margin was no longer comfortable. The only checks on the advance had come at sea. A Japanese thrust toward Port Moresby had been turned back at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, and the back of the Japanese carrier fleet had been broken at Midway in June. But the sea was not where the fate of Papua would be settled. If the Japanese could not take Port Moresby by sailing around the coast, they would take it by marching over the top of the island, across the Owen Stanley Range, down the narrow mountain path that history would come to know as the Kokoda Track. And to support that overland push, they wanted a base on the water at the southeastern corner of Papua, a place from which their navy could threaten Port Moresby from behind, while their army came at it from in front. The place they wanted was a deep-water harbor that almost no one in Australia could have found on a map. Its name was Milne Bay. It was, by any honest description, a terrible place to send men to fight. The bay was more than 35 kilometers long, a sheltered harbor ringed by the heavily wooded Stirling Range, and along its northern shore ran a narrow coastal strip soggy with sago and mangrove swamp. The area was known for 3 things, and all 3 were miseries. It was known for torrential rain that fell almost without stopping. It was known for the flooding that the rain produced, which turned every track into a channel of mud deep enough to swallow a truck. And it was known for malaria, a sickness that would in the end shadow every man who served there. One Australian who served there said afterward that even without a war, Milne Bay would have been a hellhole, a place where the sun hardly ever shone, and it rained all the time, stinking hot, disease-ridden. A pilot of No. 75 Squadron remembered the airstrips as primitive, carved straight through the coconut trees, and the rain as something he did not think ever stopped. Into this, the Allies had decided to build a forward air base. American engineers and Australian troops had arrived in June of 1942 to begin the work, hacking 3 airstrips, roads, and wharves out of the plantation and the swamp. The reason it was worth the effort was strategic, and both sides understood it with perfect clarity. An airbase at Milne Bay would shield Port Moresby's seaward flank from any Japanese naval thrust around the coast. It would open a route by which Allied troops could one day be carried along the Papuan shoreline toward the Japanese beachheads at Buna, without ever having to climb the brutal spine of the Owen Stanleys. And it would put the great Japanese fortress at Rabaul within reach of Australian bombers, which until now had been forced to make a dangerous crossing of the mountains to strike at it. 3 advantages, each of them serious, all of them gathered in one harbor roughly 370 kilometers from Port Moresby. What the Allies understood, the enemy understood too. Japanese aircraft discovered the new strips on the 4th of August, 1942, and the commanders at Rabaul drew the obvious conclusion. Milne Bay would make an ideal staging point for their navy, the place from which to close one jaw of a pincer on Port Moresby, while the army pushed the other jaw overland. The plan was sound, but there was a flaw buried inside it, a single assumption that no one on the Japanese side thought to question, and it was the kind of flaw that does not show itself until men are already dying for it. The airstrips, the Japanese reasoned, had only just become operational, which meant the garrison guarding them must be small. The bay would be decided by men, and on the question of how many men were waiting there, the enemy was about to be more wrong than it had ever been in the war. So it is the men we have to meet first. The man the Australians sent to hold Milne Bay was Major General Cyril Clowes, 50 years old, a professional soldier who had spent his entire working life in the service of Australia and the Empire. He had been among the very first class of cadets to enter the Royal Military College at Duntroon in 1911. He had gone ashore at Anzac on the morning of the 25th of April, 1915, and directed naval gunfire as an artillery observation officer through the Gallipoli campaign. He had won a Military Cross on the Western Front in 1916 and a Distinguished Service Order in 1918 for the handling of his division's guns at the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux. In Greece, in the spring of 1941, when the rapidly advancing Germans threatened to outflank a retreating Commonwealth column at the Pineos Gorge, it was Clowes who was sent forward to steady a line held by little more than a single New Zealand battalion, and the line held long enough for the main force to get away. This was not a man who panicked. He was calm to the point of silence, pipe-smoking, intelligent, reticent. Throughout the army, they knew him as Silent Cyril, and the nickname was not a complaint. It was a description. He very nearly did not reach Milne Bay at all, flying in from Port Moresby on the 13th of August in an American transport, with an inexperienced pilot who had no maps and got lost over country he did not know. Clowes came down at last on a strip covered in water and wrote afterward that they had arrived largely by guess and by God. He took formal command of Milne Force on the 22nd of August. What he commanded was not one body of men, but 2, and the difference between them mattered more than anyone outside the bay understood. By the middle of August, there were some 7,500 Australians and 1,400 Americans in the area, close to 9,000 men in all, of whom about 4,500 were infantry. Along the northern shore, he had deployed the militia battalions of the 7th Brigade under Brigadier John Field, the 9th, the 25th, and the 61st. Citizen soldiers often underrated by men who had not yet seen them fight. And it would be the 61st that took the first blow of the battle. Held back in reserve was the 18th Brigade under Brigadier George Wooten, the 2nd 9th, the 2nd 10th, and the 2nd 12th, hardened regulars of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, who had stood the siege of Tobruk and garrisoned Syria, and who had only recently arrived. There was a battery of field artillery, there were anti-aircraft guns, there were the Hudson light bombers of No. 6 Squadron, and above all, there were the Kittyhawk fighter bombers of No. 75 and No. 76 Squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force, flying off those primitive, waterlogged strips. It was a real force, larger than anyone on the other side imagined. But it was spread thin around a very long bay, and its commander did not yet know where the blow would land. Against him was coming a different kind of soldier entirely. The force moving toward Milne Bay was drawn from Japan's naval marines, the Special Naval Landing Forces, troops trained specifically for amphibious assault and carrying a reputation for discipline and ferocity earned across a string of swift victories in the months since Pearl Harbor. They were elite, and they knew it. They came with 2 light tanks, Type 95 machines that could move, it would turn out. Where the defenders had convinced themselves no armor could move. They were commanded in the first instance by Commander Hayashi, leading the main landing party of the Kure 5th Special Naval Landing Force, and behind them stood the authority of the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, the cruisers and destroyers that would carry the Marines in and stand offshore to support them. This was the deeper trap inside the battle. The Australians could win the daylight with their Kittyhawks and lose the darkness to the guns of warships they could not reach. And the Marines, however cut off from supply, were never entirely alone so long as those ships could close the coast under cover of night. How weak they believed the enemy to be is the whole heart of the matter. Japanese intelligence had concluded that the new airfields were held by no more than 2 or 3 companies of Australian infantry, somewhere between 300 and 600 men. The true figure was nearly 9,000. It is one of the largest single misjudgments of the Pacific War. The plan that grew out of it had a certain confident logic. The Marines would land near Rabi, drive west along the coast, and seize the airfield before the handful of defenders could organize. The operation had been handed to the Navy rather than the Army after a dispute between the 2 services, the Army unwilling to risk its barges in waters it knew Allied aircraft could reach. So the Navy's Marines would do it, lightly equipped, trusting to the night attacks and close fighting that had shattered poorly defended positions everywhere else they had gone. The operation had a code and a rhythm that tells you something about how the wider war was crowding in on Japan. After the airfields were spotted, the plan to seize them, which the Japanese called Operation Re, was given a high priority, and then postponed. Because on the 7th of August, the Americans landed on Guadalcanal, far to the east. And suddenly the Japanese High Command had 2 fires to fight at once. The choice it made was to commit to Milne Bay, a force sized for the small garrison it imagined rather than the large one that was actually there. Clowes, for his part, faced a problem with no clean solution, and it is worth sitting with the shape of it, because everything he was later criticized for flows directly from it. He had to hold the airfields, but he could not assume the airfields were the only target, because nothing prevented the Japanese from landing a second force on the southern or the western shore of a bay more than 35 kilometers long. And a second landing in the wrong place could cut his force in 2. The rain had reduced the few tracks to channels of mud that swallowed vehicles whole, so he could not move troops quickly by land, and he did not have the barges to move them by water. Whatever he committed slowly, and could not easily call back. For this reason, he kept his hardened 18th Brigade in hand rather than flinging it forward at the first contact, and waited to learn where the real weight of the attack would fall. The Japanese did not know how strong he was. He did not know how strong they were, nor whether a second wave was forming up behind the first. From the 4th of August onward, their bombers had been falling on the unfinished base, and the defenders knew with certainty that something was coming. They did not know how much. The ground all this would be fought over was a thin thing. Along the northern shore ran a narrow corridor of flat land, in places only a few kilometers wide, hemmed between the water on one side and the steep wooded slopes of the Sterling Range on the other, and strung along it were the coconut plantations, the scattered mission stations, and the 3 new airstrips that were the whole point of the place. There was nowhere to maneuver in depth. An attacker coming along that corridor from the east had to come more or less straight at the defenders, toward the easternmost strip the Japanese most wanted, and a defender could not give much ground without giving up the airfields themselves. It was a battlefield shaped like a funnel, and into the wide end of it, on a wet night at the end of August, the Marines poured. Late on the night of the 25th of August, 1942, the Marines came ashore, and the first thing that went wrong for them. They had meant to land near Rabi, within striking distance of the airfields. Instead, in the dark and the rain and the confusion of an unfamiliar coast, they put their roughly 2,000 men down between the villages of Wagga Wagga and Wandala, about 11 kilometers east of where they intended to be. And almost at once, they blundered into the militiamen of the 61st Battalion. The fighting in the blackness was confused and savage, men firing at sound and shadow. But the decision of the battle was not made that night on the ground. It was made the following morning, in the air. The militiamen of the 61st held through that first night against an enemy who had expected to brush them aside. And in doing so, they bought the most valuable thing the defenders had, which was the few hours of daylight that followed. When the light came up on the 26th, the Kittyhawks of No. 75 and No. 76 squadrons came down over the landing beaches at the height of the treetops and went to work on what the Japanese had brought ashore. They destroyed the barges drawn up on the sand. They burned the stores stacked on the beaches at Wagga Wagga and Wandala. An invasion that depended entirely on what it had carried with it was being stripped of its supply before it had properly begun. The pilots flew so low and worked the ground so thoroughly that one observer remembered palm fronds and bullets and dead snipers coming down together with the rain. It was brutal, unglamorous, decisive work, flown off flooded strips in weather that should have grounded everything. And it would later be remembered by some as the forgotten finest hour of the Australian Air Force. Nor was it only the fighters. The Hudson Light Bombers of No. 6 Squadron went out after the Japanese destroyers that came to shell the bay, so that even the Navy that owned the darkness paid a price for entering those waters. The same fate met the reinforcement. A further body of Marines, some 350 men, meant to strengthen the landing, had their barges caught and wrecked on the way, and were left marooned on Goodenough Island, out of the battle entirely before they could reach it. This was the pattern that would hold for the next 12 days, and it is the real reason the enemy would in the end be forced to stop. By day, when the Kittyhawks could fly, the bay belonged to the Australians, and a Japanese force in the open was a Japanese force being killed. The Marines who had come to take the airfields found themselves within hours of stepping ashore, fighting a battle they could no longer feed. An invasion that cannot be resupplied is on a clock from the first morning. And though the Marines did not know it yet, flushed with a year of victories, the burning of those barges had already begun to decide the thing. By night, the whole arithmetic reversed. When darkness grounded the aircraft, the Japanese moved, and they moved with a skill the conditions could not blunt. The two Type 95 tanks came out of the rain and the blackness and broke clean through infantry, who had been assured that armor could not work in such ground, their guns appearing exactly where nothing was supposed to be, doing damage out of all proportion to their number because the men in front of them had no good answer and had to learn one under fire. Japanese warships stood into the bay on successive nights, when no Kittyhawk could rise to meet them, and shelled the defenses and put fresh troops ashore. And there was a cruelty in the rhythm of it. The way each evening handed the bay back to the enemy, just as the exhausted defenders most needed it to stay theirs. The Marines pushed westward toward the strips, wading through the flooded swamp to work around the flanks of the Australian positions, fighting through the area around the mission station the soldiers knew as KB Mission. And for several nights, it was genuinely unclear whether they could be held. On the 29th of August, the reinforcement commander, Yano, came ashore with a further 769 men and took over the direction of a battle from which Hayashi, the original commander, had now been removed by death. For the men holding the line through those nights, the battle was a thing endured as much as fought. They slept, when they slept at all, in weapon pits that filled with water as fast as they could bail them. The mud was in everything, in the rifles, in the food, in the bandages, in the boots that rotted on men's feet. Malaria moved through the ranks as surely as any enemy, taking men out of the line who had never been touched by a bullet. At night the warships came and the shells fell, and there was nothing to do but lie in the flooded dark and wait for them to stop, knowing that when they stopped, the Marines would come wading out of the swamp. Through these nights, Clowes was fighting very nearly blind, and the phrase is not a flourish. He did not know the true strength of the force in front of him. He did not know whether a second force was about to come ashore behind him on a beach he could not cover, and so he held his reserve in hand and absorbed the blows as they came, a course that was militarily correct and personally expensive. He wrote privately that he had never quite realized how dense the fog of war could be, and from a soldier with his decorations and his 30 years, the admission carries real weight. It was not indecision. It was a man refusing to gamble away his only uncommitted brigade, chasing shadows through a swamp at night. But from a great distance, it did not look that way. And a great distance was exactly where his harshest critics sat. At General MacArthur's headquarters, and at the headquarters of the Australian commander Blamey, the mood was anything but calm. This was the first land battle the Allied High Command had fought in the theater since the catastrophe in the Philippines, and the nervousness ran high and ran downward. Major General George VC, watching the atmosphere at the top, caught it in a single image, calling it like a barometer in a cyclone, up and down every 2 minutes. From that height, Clowes' refusal to fling his reserve forward looked like hesitation, and the messages began to flow toward him, even as the battle still hung in the balance. Blamey suggested that, by not acting with greater speed, Clowes was liable to miss the chance of dealing completely with the enemy. The criticism left Clowes cold, for the plain reason that great speed was simply not possible in that mud with the resources he had. What VC feared, in a private letter, was worse than impatience. That headquarters was forming a wrong impression of the troops themselves, when the truth was that those soldiers were winning a battle their superiors could not see. From Port Moresby, Clowes' friend and superior Sidney Rowell defended him and wished aloud that the staff officers doing the criticizing could come and see the jungle for themselves instead of judging it from dry and distant rooms. The friendship between the two men, 30 years old by now, would in time cost Clowes a great deal. But that reckoning was still weeks away. The immediate pressure built, and it built toward a single night and a single airstrip. On the night of the 30th of August, the Japanese gathered the weight of what they had left and threw it against the easternmost airfield. The strip the whole battle had been fought to take. It was the most determined assault they had yet made. Wave following wave across open ground into the muzzle flashes of dug-in infantry and the fire of the guns, pressing toward a killing ground the defenders had prepared and would not surrender. For the men holding the line, it was the longest night of the battle. A thing of noise and rain and tracer and the constant fear that somewhere the weight would prove too much and the line would go. It did not go. The defenders held. The attack broke against them in the darkness and fell back. And it fell back having paid a price the Marines could not afford and could not replace. After that night, the whole character of the battle changed. The Japanese were no longer advancing. They were a force that had spent its strongest blow and failed to land it. And from this point onward, they would be retreating, even before they were willing to admit it to themselves. The nights had worn the defenders down to a strange, brittle alertness, the kind in which exhausted men in the dark begin to see an enemy in every shadow. And at least one stray animal blundering into a mine in the small hours was enough to set a whole nervous perimeter firing at nothing. But the fear, real as it was, no longer pointed the right way. It was the Marines now who were running out of everything. On the 1st of September, the Australians began to push east along the foreshore, the Kittyhawks working ahead of them, the infantry breaking one Japanese position after another along the muddy edge of the bay. By the 3rd, the enemy had begun to withdraw in earnest. It was not a pursuit in any clean or rapid sense. It was a grind, a matter of pushing forward through the same mud and rain that had defined every other day. Clearing position after position along a narrow strip of ground with the swamp on one side and the bay on the other. The Japanese, even in retreat, even starving, even beaten, did not simply give way. They fought from cover, they left snipers behind them, and every position had to be taken at a cost. And it is here that we come to the man whose name ought to be the best known of the whole battle and is among the least. Corporal John Alexander French, known to almost everyone as Jack, was a barber's son from Crow's Nest, a small town north of Toowoomba in Queensland. He was a quiet, modest, big fair man, a gifted rugby league winger they had called the flying winger, remembered as much for his sense of fair play as for his speed. He had been the first man in Crow's Nest to enlist when the war came, on the 22nd of October, 1939. He had become engaged to a young woman named Dulcie McCahon in March of 1940, and had decided to wait until the war was over before they married, in case he should come home wounded. He had fought across North Africa with the 2nd 9th Battalion, through the capture of Diyar Abub, through the siege of Tobruk, through the garrisoning of Syria. He had come home in March of 1942, and in August he had come north to this swamp. On the afternoon of the 4th of September, near a place called Goroni, the section that Jack French was leading crossed a creek to attack a Japanese position and ran into terrific fire from 3 machine gun posts. He ordered his men to take cover. Then he went forward alone. He silenced the first post with grenades. He came back to his section for more grenades, advanced a second time, and silenced the second post. Then, armed with a Thompson gun, firing it from the hip as he walked, he advanced on the third. He was seen to be badly hit by the fire from that post, and he kept walking, and he kept firing. When the gun fell silent at last and his section moved up, they found the 3 crews dead in their pits and Jack French's body lying on the lip of the third one. He was 28 years old. He was awarded the Victoria Cross the highest decoration for valor the Commonwealth can bestow, and he never knew it. His fiancée Dulcie, afterward, described him in a newspaper as a quiet, steady boy, modest and unassuming, the stuff that real heroes are made of, and said that while she was proud to have been engaged to such a brave man, she was heartbroken that he was not alive to receive the reward for his courage. He had not lived to come home and marry her. He had walked into the third gun instead, because the men behind him could not move while it was firing, and that was the kind of soldier he was. By the time French made his lone advance, the question on the Japanese side was no longer whether to take the airfields, but whether anyone at all could be got off the beach alive. Yano, now wounded, signaled what his Marines could no longer be asked to do. The Army's relief, a body called the Aoba Detachment, was not scheduled to reach Milne Bay until the 11th of September, and would have arrived to find no one left to relieve. Faced with this, the Japanese command did the one thing it had not done anywhere in the war. It accepted defeat on land, and it ordered an evacuation. Between the 4th and the 7th of September, the survivors, most of them sick, many of them wounded, all of them hungry, were lifted off the northeastern shore of the bay. And on the night of the 5th and 6th, the cruiser Tenryu took off roughly 1,300 of them and carried them away into the dark, leaving their dead behind on the ground they had failed to take. A Japanese amphibious invasion had been fought to a standstill and abandoned. It had simply never happened before. Everywhere else, so far, the Japanese had come and stayed and won. At Milne Bay, for the first time, they came, and they could not stay, and they left. Victory has a price, and at Milne Bay the price was still being counted as the last barges pulled away from the shore. Of the men the Japanese had committed to the battle, more than 600 lay dead on the ground they had failed to take, and more would die afterward, sick and starving, trying to make their way overland toward Buna. Of the roughly 2,800 who had landed, well under half came away. The Australian dead and missing came to something in the order of 160, and a small number of Americans killed, a loss heavy in human terms and yet a fraction of the enemy's. But the bare numbers conceal the worst of it, and the worst of it has to be said. Among the Allied dead were 36 Australians who had been taken prisoner and then executed. 59 Papuans were killed, some of them women who had been murdered. Many of those who died had been bayoneted, and some had been badly mutilated. This was not a thing the soldiers who found them would ever forget, and it hardened them in a way that carried forward into every bitter battle of the New Guinea campaign that came after. And the dying did not end when the shooting did. For behind the battle casualties came the slower toll of the swamp itself, the malaria and the fevers and the rot that the conditions bred. It is one of the quiet truths of the New Guinea War that the country killed and disabled more soldiers than the enemy did. And Milne Bay was where that truth first announced itself in full. The victory itself was real, and at first it was loudly celebrated. From the 1st of September, even before the last of the fighting was finished, Australian newspapers carried the news, and General MacArthur publicly named Clowes as the commander, ably clearing the bay. For a country that had spent a year reading nothing but accounts of retreat and surrender, the message that came out of Milne Bay mattered almost more than the ground it had been fought over. And the man who put it most plainly was Brigadier John Field, who summed up what his troops had proved in a single sentence. The Japanese, he said, was not a Superman. It seems an obvious thing to say now. In the late winter of 1942, after Singapore and the Philippines and a year of apparent invincibility, it was very nearly a revelation. and it was a revelation that men had died in a swamp to deliver. For the families reading their newspapers at home, who had spent a year afraid in a way later generations would struggle to imagine, the news was the first in a very long while that did not end in withdrawal, and they seized on it. And then, with the battle won, the recriminations began, and they fell on the man who had won it. Cyril Clowes was awarded a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in May of 1943 for his success at Milne Bay. And the battle was the high point of his career, and also the beginning of the end of it. In late September, only weeks after the victory, Blame dismissed Raoul, Clowes' closest ally and oldest friend, in a bitter falling out. And in the reshuffle that followed, another officer was placed over Clowes, tarred in Blame's mind by his 30-year friendship with a man now out of favor, and quietly doubted by a MacArthur who had never warmed to him. Clowes found himself eased out of the war he had just helped to turn. He spent much of the rest of the year on leave or laid low with malaria. The war moved north and west into New Guinea, and Clowes was left behind in the bay he had saved. And then, in 1943, sent home to a command far from any fighting, where he remained for the rest of the war. The man who had handed Australia its first land victory over the Japanese was set quietly aside. The qualities that won the battle, the patience, the refusal to be panicked, the willingness to be thought too slow rather than be actually too rash, were the very qualities that did him no good in the politics that followed it. He had read the swamp correctly and been punished for the reading. What the victory had bought, beyond the airfields, was larger than any single career. Port Moresby's eastern flank was secure. The coastal route toward Buna remained open for the offensives still to come. And the thing that mattered most could not be measured in territory, because what had been broken at Milne Bay was an idea. The idea on which a year of Japanese victories had partly rested. The idea that the Japanese army could not be beaten on the ground. It belonged too to a larger turning of 1942, the months in which the Japanese Navy was broken at Midway. The Americans went over to the offensive at Guadalcanal, and the Kokoda Drive reached its limit and began the long retreat back over the mountains. Milne Bay was the land piece of that turning, the proof that what was true at sea could be made true ashore. No one understood that better, or had more reason to, than a British commander fighting the same army 1,000 miles to the west. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, waging his own desperate campaign in the jungles of Burma, and later to serve as Governor-General of Australia, grasped with absolute precision what Milne Bay was worth. It was the Australians, he wrote, who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army, and those who had been in Burma had cause to remember it. And yet the country whose soldiers had proven it very nearly let the memory slip through its fingers. Milne Bay was a clear and decisive victory, and it has never held the place in the national story that it earned. It was over quickly. It was fought in the very same weeks as the far more famous and far more drawn-out drama on the Kokoda track, where the fighting and the suffering would stretch on for months and seize the public imagination in a way a 12-day battle at the far end of Papua never quite did. And it was not reported in any real detail at the time, so that the scale of it, the sheer unlikeliness of it, were never properly fixed in the public mind. The battle and the man who won it were buried together, in a sense, the one pushed into the backwater he had saved, the other pushed out of the nation's memory beneath a name the public found easier to hold. Time has been slow to correct the record, but it has begun to. Today the swamp is quiet, and the airstrips the men fought and bled and died for have long since gone back to grass. Milne Bay is understood now for what it was: the first decisive defeat of the Japanese on land in the whole of the Second World War. a cornerstone of the long defensive struggle that kept the enemy off the Australian mainland. One of the Type 95 tanks that came out of the rain was captured, and it stands now behind glass in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. A small steel machine that once seemed unstoppable in the dark and is now a quiet exhibit that schoolchildren walk past. Jack French's name is carried by a memorial prize founded in his honor, and he lies in the war cemetery at Bomana, near Port Moresby. And the role of the Air Force, the pilots who burned the barges and starved the invasion, is at last understood for the decisive thing it was. A lesson written in a Papuan swamp that a landing can be defeated not only by the men who meet it on the beach, but by the aircraft that cut its supply down to nothing. The arguments have not entirely stopped, and that is as it should be. Historians still weigh the case of Cyril Clowes, and the verdict of the years has moved steadily in his favor, toward the view that he read an impossible situation correctly and was punished for the reading. It is worth, here near the end, being honest about the question the whole story turns on, because the truth is harder than the legend and a great deal better. The enemy did not stop at Milne Bay out of simple fear. They stopped because they had come expecting 300 to 600 men and had found nearly 9,000. They stopped because their supplies had burned on the beaches in the first hours of the first morning. They stopped because their strongest assault had broken against the airstrip and could not be made again. And they stopped because their own command, counting what was left, judged the position lost and chose to carry off what men it could rather than lose them all. That is not the story of an enemy frightened into flight. It is the story of an enemy outnumbered, beaten on supply, beaten in the air, and beaten on the ground, by militiamen and veterans and pilots in a swamp their own side had nearly given up on. And it is a far greater and far truer thing than fear. In the very same days, on the Kokoda track to the north, another Australian stand was being made under a brigadier named Arnold Potts, by a scratch command called Maroubra Force, holding a ridge above a creek against the Japanese drive on Port Moresby. There, between the 26th and the 31st of August, a young private of the 2nd 14th Battalion named Bruce Kingsbury charged into the enemy with a Bren gun firing from the hip, cut a path through them, bought his battalion the minutes it needed to save its headquarters, and was killed instantly by a sniper, and was given a Victoria Cross of his own, the first ever awarded for an action on Australian territory. That stand ended not in a sea evacuation, but in a bitter fighting withdrawal, a giving of ground to buy time. 2 stands in 1 week, on 2 sides of the same mountains. One enemy sailed away, the other was only slowed. Between them, the spell was broken. The swamp is still there, and so is the rain. It falls now on grass where the strips used to be, on a harbor that carries no mark of any of it, as indifferent to the men who died there as it was indifferent to them while they lived. They gave their country something it had not possessed for a year, the knowledge that the enemy bearing down on it could be stopped. And they gave it in the worst conditions Australian soldiers faced in the whole of the war, in mud and malaria and a rain that never seemed to end. And a great many of them never came home to be thanked for it. Jack French never went back to Crow's Nest to marry Dulcie. The Papuans murdered on their own ground were never named in any headline. The militiamen who took the first blow in the dark, the veterans who finished the work, the pilots who flew at the height of the trees, were proven right about a thing the rest of the world had begun to doubt. They were the first of all the Allies to prove the enemy could be broken, in a place at the very edge of the map. And the country they proved it for buried the proof and the man who delivered it, beneath a more famous name. If you had never heard of Milne Bay before today, say so in the comments and carry the name of it with you a while. And if you want to know how the same enemy was stopped a second time, in the mountains Watch this next.